intersections of tech and public policy. I'm not going to give introductions to folks other than their names, just so you know who's who. So we have to my left is Sally Wentworth, and she is the Vice President of Global Policy Development at the Internet Society. To Sally's left, and I'll make sure I'm getting this right. Yes, that's Amr Aljowaily. He is a minister at Egypt's mission to the UN. And then, yes, to Amr's left is Carolina de Cresce Debs from the Embassy of Brazil. And then we had a swap there. So to Carolina's left is David Satola of the World Bank. He's the ICT legal advisor. To David's left, we have Andrea Glorioso, and he is a counselor for digital agency at the UN delegation to the US. And to Andrea's left is Veni Markowski from Bulgaria, and he's an ICANN vice president for UN engagement. So the way this is going to work is that each of our presenters is going to give some opening remarks, sort of sub 10 minutes. We're going to try to stick to about 7. After that, I'll take the moderator's prerogative to ask a question or two, and then we'll open it up for questions and discussion with the audience. And we really want to make this very participatory, so if you can think of questions as we're going along, that would be great. So, Sally, if you want to kick us off.
Let's see. Good afternoon, everyone. And thanks for coming out. As was said, it's kind of a miserable day, but good to see so many people here. It's also great to see so many friendly faces and some new ones as well, which I think is exemplary of the internet governance space, so to speak. It has been a long-ranging discussion at the UN level for over a decade on, I think as this says, how do policymakers interact with the internet? What's the role of government? It's been a bit of a niche space for a number of years, and I think in probably the last year, maybe 2 years, it's really emerged as a topic that is getting attention across a wide range of, in the media, among the highest levels of government. We were just talking that, heads of state are now addressing issues related to the governance of the internet and policy development in the internet. So it's definitely a hot topic, and there's a lot going on in this space that really does matter for the intersection between technology and public policy. In 2015, and I think others will cover this in more detail, the UN is going to review the UN Summit on the Information Society, the World Summit on the Information Society. And so here's your first acronym, the WSIS. They will review what's happened since 2003 and 2005 when the UN first really took this issue up at a global level. And they're going to do this in the General Assembly where they're going to say, how far have we come? And in terms of developing the internet, growing the internet, making it a tool of the information society, bringing about a truly information society. And then they're also going to look at what needs to be done, what else needs to be done. And obviously how that shapes out will have considerable implications for global governance and the range of internet governance issues that fall out of that debate. So as we think about what the UN might say, what the UN might do this year, I do think it's important to look back a little bit and frame that discussion. And I think that's a little bit of my role here, and then there'll be a lot of follow-on comments. The question really is, in an environment like the internet, where the technology is truly decentralized, where there are a host of different, what we call stakeholders. And what do we mean by that? There are a lot of different players that touch different parts of this technology that are making decisions about how it grows. And even setting aside the governance, they're making decisions about protocol development. They're making decisions about technical operations at the network layer. People are making decisions about what content to access, what content to publish. There are all of these decisions being made, and there's innovation happening at every layer of that. And the question then becomes, what do policymakers do with that? How do you get involved with a global decentralized medium that crosses borders, that's changing constantly, and that doesn't respond the same way to public policy in the traditional way that it has normally been developed? And how do you create a sustainable, robust public policy environment where the things that you care about and desire about the internet can continue to flourish, where it can continue to grow, can continue to innovate, but at the same time is something people trust and that respects the free flow of information and all of the other things. It's interesting that model, that multi-stakeholder model, which is sort of the phrase of the decade, so to speak, has really actually has evolved since we first started talking about it, and the institutions involved have also evolved. So when you look at an intergovernmental layer, you see within organizations, even like the OECD, you see technical input being enabled, civil society input being enabled. That was not the case 10 years ago. Within the UN system, you also see opportunities for more stakeholder engagement. So the system is evolving. Within the technical organizations, we work very closely with the Internet Engineering Task Force. Veni is here from ICANN, but other parts, the regional internet registries, there's a lot of work to globalize their engagement, a lot of effort to make them more inclusive and more reflective of the world. Within governments, you see efforts and understanding that it's not enough to just pass a piece of legislation and hope that the internet somehow responds to that. You really need to understand where does the technology intersect? Will the things we want, the public policy objectives we want, actually work in a technology space? Brazil has a very innovative model of bringing multiple stakeholders to the table. Other governments are doing the same thing. So I think when we start looking at what's happening going forward in the UN, it is important to maybe pause for a moment and reflect on how the ecosystem has changed. We have a long way to go. We have a long way to go to address these questions of globalization, these questions of inclusiveness, accountability, other things. But it is useful to think about what it means to bring multiple stakeholders to the table and why that's relevant. It's not just a phrase, it's not just a buzzword, it's how you do policy development in the age of the internet. And I would say then that the challenge for the UN this year is, as they look to review the WSIS, they look to review the progress made in the information society, is to what extent can the UN at the highest level, at the General Assembly level, really tackle the challenges. And we hear a big challenge will be development, of course, with sustainable development goals underway, a review in New York, and of course security, the buzzword of the day. Can the UN tackle these in a way that's productive, constructive, and inclusive and reflective of the technology and of the information society that we declared that we wanted over 10 years ago and needs and should persist going forward? And I think that's going to be the real challenge for this year in New York as New York takes up the questions of the WSIS and internet governance in general.
Can I ask you just one very brief follow-up question. Can you describe in a sentence or two, and I know I'm asking a lot, but what is the role of governments, actual state governments, meant to be in the operation of the internet right now, sort of on paper?
And the operation? Oh.
Internet governance, what is the role?
Well, I think governments continue to have a role to do public policy development. In the operation of the actual networks, those are generally held in private hands and are built and developed by private parties.
But in sort of the ICANN model, the sort of structure that we currently have for internet governance, the role of actual
right. I mean, and it varies based on institution. ICANN is one institution, one piece of the internet governance ecosystem. There are others. We work in the Internet Engineering Task Force, which is protocol development. And people there participate as individuals. They don't participate as entities, whether it's a government or a company or a whatever. So I think it varies, and that's okay. There are changing roles depending on the solution that's being looked for.
Okay, thank
Thank you very much. And I'd like to start by thanking Professor Aronson for the invitation, Kyle for facilitating our participation, Veni for the introduction. It's very good to be. It's very good to be around good colleagues whom we've been before. Sally, it appears we were together in the two summits, or actually in the two phases of the summit, 03 and 05, and to make also new friends. And colleagues, I'm happy to be in the session moderated by Nancy and with the participation of all the other colleagues. So why am I here? I mean, why did Professor Emerson think about inviting us? I think I have an overhead presentation. If we can put it, Carl, that would be great. Otherwise, it'll be available also to all. Why was there a need for George Washington University, the Elliott School, to actually reach out to a delegate at the United Nations? The reason being that that in 03, that's when it all started in 2003, the first phase of the two summits on the World Summit on Information Society, as Sally was mentioning, was convened. And it was probably the first time for the diplomatic community to start addressing internet issues. And I mean the general diplomatic community, or because we have always had, thank you, we have always had the oldest actually organization in the world, the International Telecommunications Union, dealing more or less with the technical aspects of the internet. But for that to be elevated to the level of attention of heads of state, it did acquire a new dimension by focusing, as Sadi has mentioned, on the public policy issues. So the UN was brought in through the World Summit on Information Society, which was an initiative by the International Communications Union, the ITU. However, it assumed a much wider perspective and it was put in a much wider context, being brought onto the UN and elevated to a level of heads of states and governments. So what did WSIS do? It convened, as we said, on two phases. Probably, I think it was the only summit of the UN that was convened on two phases: 03 in Geneva, 05 in Tunis. And the particular issue of internet governance, which is the subject of our discussion today, was not that much addressed in the Geneva summit. It was so new to the extent that despite 2 or 3 years of preparatory work and prep coms, there wasn't still that clear definition even of the issue, to the extent that it could command consensus and a normative document in Geneva. So all what Geneva did is actually it created, basically not all, but within internet governance issues, it created something called the WIG, the Working Group on Internet Governance, which actually its main task, and you'd imagine its main task was actually to propose a working definition of the internet governance, to identify the issues, to map the issues more or less. So Geneva was basically the starting point to create that particular mechanism in order to start to address the public policy issues of internet governance. Soon thereafter, we had actually we had the convening of the WIGIG, which was also one of the first experiments of its kind in a multi-stakeholder working group. The representatives in that particular group were representatives of government, but also of private sector, of civil society, and others. My country, Egypt, was represented through Bahir Esmod there, and it was, again, a learning experience to see that form of dialogue and exchange develop. When was it all elaborated? It was basically in Tunis. So in Tunis, you have what I would claim is the first intergovernmentally negotiated document that attempts to set a normative framework for internet governance issues. And as you know, any multilateral document is one that has a certain moral and political value. So actually this particular document, it may not be a legally contractual document, but it has a high value as a political commitment, and of course as an expression of the will of the international community in this regard. And I was there, as we said, at the two phases of the summit, and I can tell you that how arduous the negotiations were, to the extent that that particular document, the Tunis agenda, and the particular section on internet governance, so in fact it was chaired by the then Pakistan permanent representative to Geneva, Masoud Khan, and I believe we gavelled it at almost a few minutes before midnight, before the heads of state and government arrive. And he took a standing ovation from every single delegation, including delegation, I don't want to name them, that had diametrically opposed positions. Yet they saw in that document, each delegation, each perspective saw an aspect of his or her position, and his or her country's position in this regard. So I would very much encourage you to devote as much attention, particularly you academics, business, civil society, experts, students, but also, of course, the wider diplomatic community, since this is more or less the Bible of internet governance for the multilateral diplomacy, in a particular section from 29 to 82. Still, that was 2005. Why again would George Washington University need to outreach to the multilateral diplomacy once again? It's basically because we're all revisiting this back. So 10 years after Tunis, in December 2005, we have the so-called review, a high-level meeting of the General Assembly to be convened at the highest political level, which in diplomatic terminology usually means at a summit level. It is supposed to overview the implementation of the commitments that were done both in Tunis and in Geneva, 03 and 05. And hence, this particular year is an important one, because not only is it going to assess the progress in the implementation of this particular implementation, but actually the modalities resolution, which you will see now, that was adopted at the General Assembly last year. The modalities resolution is very, very clear that not only is there a review of the progress of the implementation, but also a charting forward of the gaps, or an identification of the gaps and a charting forward of what could be done to address these gaps. So there is another opportunity for the international community in the wider sense of the world to actually revisit how good we did on implementing, but also how far we need to go in the future. You will see that probably the Tunis agenda addressed what I would say 3 or 4 particular issues. First, it addressed the principles. So you would find a lot of declaratory language in the Tunis agenda, in the sense of what are the founding principles for a dialogue, for an exchange on internet governance. But it also addressed the priorities. You will see many, many references in the Tunis agenda on what should be the highest priorities of internet governance. And I'm particularly wedded to one paragraph that we were very active on the delegation of Egypt, and we actually did a lot on into elaborating it, and that's paragraph 65. I hope it is somewhere here. And I would very much invite you to actually look at this paragraph, and each within his or her own domain of work, see how that paragraph, which was agreed upon by every single state, the United States, Egypt, and Brazil and everyone else, how far has this particular paragraph framed and guided the work of each one of us within his or her own multi-stakeholder community. Look at what it says. It asks for the maximization of the participation of developing countries in decision-making regarding internet governance. But not only that, it's not a matter of inviting someone to actually participate at the engineering task force or ICANN. It's that the decisions of internet governance should reflect the interests of developing countries. So it really sets the path forward to what is expected out of the information society, that it enables developing countries to leap forward and to make a shortcut, more or less, towards their development ideas. And I think this is probably even more relevant to the Institute of International Economics, as probably your focus is on here.
So I'm going to ask that we circle back after everyone's spoken about, I think you're going to talk about next steps, right?
Sure.
Or next, maybe we can sort of do that as a second pass.
Very good.
Can I ask you just very quickly? I'm sorry. I was going to ask what sort of, in a very sort of simplistic way, what problem is this process attempting to solve? And I think it seems like you answered it. It is the participation, that the current framework is not honoring the participation of developing countries adequately, if you, in a sentence or two.
I mean, not particularly. So every UN process has an established mechanism of reviewing progress and charting the way forward. So it's nothing peculiar to the World Summit on Information Society. It's actually something that, for example, you have the Beijing +10 on women, you have the Cairo +10 on population development, and so on and so forth. But we need to see and measure how well we implemented our own commitments, and what remains and the gaps that remains in order to bridge them forward.
Okay, excellent, thank you.
Thank you.
First of all, I'd like to thank Susan Ransom and George Washington University and the and the Washington chapter of the Internet Society for inviting Brazil to be here. Since I only have a few minutes, I'm just going to give you an overview. What is the Brazilian government's perspective on Internet governance, as well as the reasoning behind it. Brazil is a strong supporter of the multi-stakeholder model. Brazil believes that for Internet governance, it requires the active participation of all stakeholders. And we believe in that not out of some abstract concept, but that is derived from our experience with CGI.pr that Sally has mentioned. It is the Brazilian Internet Steering Committee. It is the main body in Brazil in charge of coordinating, integrate Internet service initiatives. And it's truly a multi-stakeholder body because it has 21 members out of the different stakeholder communities. And the Brazilian government only holds 9 out of the 21 seats at this committee. And the multi-stakeholder model, as many of you are aware, was also used to prepare and conduct the Net Mundial meeting, which took place last year in April in São Paulo. And this was a groundbreaking meeting because it was prepared and conducted in a truly multi-stakeholder fashion. It actually received over 180 contributions, and it generated as an outcome the Net Mundial multi-stakeholder statement. This statement, if you consult, it's going to have it hopes to contribute to the future of Internet governance discussions. It includes some principles and also a roadmap. And another initiative that recently has been launched as well is the Net Mundial initiative. This is an initiative that is still under discussion, and it's proposed by the CGI.pr along with ICANN and in partnership with the World Economic Forum. But it hopes to actually launch a multi-stakeholder online platform in order to share and support some bottom-up collaborative solution to some of the problems that were actually identified during the debates of Net Mundial. And of course, the multi-stakeholder model is at the heart of the IGF, the Internet Governance Forum. Brazil has the good fortune of hosting it for the second time. It's the first country to do so. Rio de Janeiro already hosted IGF in 2007. And João Pessoa is going to host it in November later this year. And of course, multi-stakeholder is only one part of Internet governance. Brazil is also in favor of multilateralism because Brazil believes that as Sally was mentioning, actually, that the Internet is a very complex phenomenon. It requires the execution of multiple functions, some of that in the hands of the private sector, but it also involves different dimensions and it has many different layers. And some of this, as mentioned, actually touch on some functions that are primarily or exclusively carried out by government. We have, for instance, law enforcement, cyber defense, and taxation. So Brazil believes there is a role for governments to play. That doesn't mean that the discussions cannot take place in a multi-stakeholder setting, but we believe some of this function should be carried out by government-led bodies. And, let me emphasize one point about that. Either in multi-stakeholder or in multilateral settings, Brazil will not endorse any kind of arrangement that actually infringe upon human rights or stifle innovation. Brazil has proposed, alongside the German government and with the support of multiple other countries, resolutions regarding the right to privacy in the digital area. Brazil believes, as the United Nations General Assembly has approved, that human rights that are enjoyed offline should also be valid online. And this is why we believe that without the right to privacy and respect to human rights, that we undermine the trust in the Internet that is much needed for the Internet to thrive. And I guess to sum up, Brazil is in favor of multi-stakeholder multilateral, democratic, and transparent model of internet governance. And we are also very concerned with the respect of the digital divide. We believe that we should do more to encourage that the majority of the population which is still offline to come online so they could actually enjoy all the opportunities provided by the internet. Thank you.
Can you just quickly define the Net Mundial initiative, just in case people aren't familiar with the particulars and why Brazil thinks it's necessary?
Well, there's the support of the CGI.br. CGI.br believes that there are some issues that are not addressed in other forum, and it believes that the Net Mundial initiative can add up. It doesn't aim to substitute or supplant any other initiative, any other body. It just believes that there are some issues that developing countries could raise that could be best supported at an online multi-stakeholder platform.
Okay. Do you have an example of just one issue, or what sort of?
Well, some sort of access in developing countries,
Okay.
for instance. But I guess the details, they haven't been working out yet. They have the coordinating council, so we are waiting to see what are the details and how that's going to work in practice.
Okay, great, thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Susan, the Institute, and George Washington University for inviting me here today. I'm David Satola from the World Bank. I want to use a couple of my precious minutes to explain a little bit about why the World Bank might be interested in this question, governments and internet governance, because we're not a government. We're a multilateral organization. Yeah. We're a multilateral organization that whose members are governments. Our members consist of donor countries and borrowing countries, and I think all but 2 or 3 countries in the world are members, North Korea, Cuba, for the moment anyway, and one other who escapes me. So we have a pretty good global coverage. Our primary interest in this issue of internet governance stems from our bilateral operational activities, our lending operations for different projects. Every year, we lend millions and millions of dollars or give in grants millions and millions of dollars for projects where there is an internet or ICT dimension, the most obvious of which are broadband infrastructure projects in the telecom ICT space, but also health projects dealing with health data, health infrastructure, education projects, transport projects, energy projects that have a very serious internet dimension to them, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we believe we have a fiduciary obligation to our clients when taking money from the institution to do development projects in their countries, to at least inform them that there's this other enabling environment dimension that goes along with some of these sector-specific projects. The enabling environment Sally spoke to a little bit would include, for example, the sets of laws and regulations and institutions around managing an internet process nationally and managing relations with other governments and non-governments internationally. So that's the first one. We're very interested in raising awareness for our client governments about these issues and ensuring that that awareness and sensitivity is built into our projects. We also were instrumental, for example, in creating with other partners, both regionally and globally, the Pacific Internet Governance Forum, which launched, I think, in 2010. And it was because of our involvement in a number of countries in the South Pacific that there was interest and demand generated for a regional IGF there. We're also interested generally in the development of global standards. And these global standards are in a range of areas from insolvency to telecommunications to other financial and other sectoral applications. So there's plenty of scope, I think, in this debate, the internet governance debate, for the elaboration of global standards. Finally, this year, I'm delighted to say that the World Bank's annual World Development Report, so that's our annual showcase report, is on the Internet for Development. And we're going to be talking, amongst other things, about these issues in the report. So it's the first time that I'm aware of that the World Bank will be addressing these issues head-on and in a very direct way, and hopefully in a way that our especially our borrowing governments, our client governments, will be able to implement. So that implies that there'll be some recommendations about some of these issues in the report. Small teaser there. Okay. In the remaining few minutes that I have, I just want to drill down a little bit into this issue of multi-stakeholderism. So we have up here a slide that was prepared for purposes of delivery at the first IGF in Athens in 2006. And what it was an attempt to show visually in 2 dimensions the landscape of multi-stakeholder players. And you'll see that, I mean, it's not accurate, it's not exhaustive, but it's indicative, I think, of the range of players, state, non-state, and otherwise, who are there. So we have ICANN, we have ISOC, we have the IETF. There's a spot there for national governments, there are regional governments. And I think what it shows quite clearly is just the wide range of players involved in this internet governance discussion. And I think it also clearly points out that there is a role, as we talked about earlier, for national governments in this discussion, but not at the exclusion of other players, in a complementary fashion with other players. I also want to put up one other slide here, which is the vote tally of the wicket. Everyone knows what the wicket was? Okay, most people do. It was the last World Conference on International Telecommunications in Dubai a couple of years ago. It was, I guess, December 2 years ago. So the countries indicated in green are those who voted in favor of a new treaty, and the countries in the white are the countries who either abstained or voted against. And it's roughly 89 green countries for, and about 45 white-colored coded countries against or in the who abstain. And I think what it does is it shows a little bit where the fault lines are of some of these really hoary discussions that are going to take place in the coming years about the role of governments in internet governance. There are some interesting likely suspects in the green and in the white, and then there are some unexpected appearances in both categories, I think. And I think it does show, it's not a clean cleavage along, you know, the non-aligned group versus the West and the East or anything like that. It's a real mixed bag, which shows, I think, also the difficulty that there will be in parsing through some of these roles for governments. But what it does show clearly is that there's far from a consensus among governments about what their role should be in the internet governance panoply. I think it also demonstrates weaknesses in the current formal structures for addressing what the role of governments could or should be in internet governance. This was an attempt. There have been attempts since then. There will be other attempts at trying to ensure that there's a role, a continuing role for governments in internet governance. And I think that, as previous speakers have indicated, this is not a zero-sum game. It's not an exclusionary game. It's not one or the other. I think what we're going to find going forward is that there will be complementary roles that will be played, and that governments, both donor governments, recipient governments in our context at the World Bank, will continue to be interested, very interested in this question of the role of governments in internet governance. And I'll close off there. Thank you.
David, can you just highlight which are the countries that jump out to you as sort of not being in their natural bucket?
Some of the white ones, some of the green ones.
Very diplomatic. Okay, thank you. And we have Andrea.
It was a very tough question. I didn't understand. That was a very tough question. Yeah, the answer was very good, yes. Thanks, and thanks to the organizers for having me here. I will start on this overarching question of what is the role of governments in internet governance by asking, I think the first question we should ask ourselves is, what is the role of governments in general? And I will go back later on, if I may, on the term government, because I think that is a source of confusion due to the different meaning that we give to the term in different parts of the world. But having said that, I certainly, as a civil servant of the European Union and as an Italian European citizen, think that government have a duty to, the role of governments is to perform and uphold the duties that governments have towards their citizens. And those duties are of various nature, but if I may synthesize, it will be a very long discussion, and I'm a political scientist, so I could talk very long about this. But in principle, we are talking about upholding the rule of law, ensuring that the rights are respected, enforcing the law, which is decided adopted through democratic processes. Now, the problem, of course, is how do you translate, and this is a big simplification, I completely realize it, but the problem nonetheless remains how do you translate that into an environment such as the internet, which is cross-border in nature, it's mostly cross-border, even though we should not forget that it is not the first and it is not the only cross-border human endeavor that we have experience with, because we have experience with trade, we have experience with maritime commerce, we have experience with other forms of telecommunication. Nonetheless, we should also keep in mind, or perhaps because of this, we should keep in mind that the internet is a relatively new phenomenon compared to others. And certainly to the extent that nowadays the internet is so impactful on the lives of everybody, as it was not 10 or 15 years ago, I think that all of us, we have to have a bit of patience in trying to understand how to navigate what is indeed a new phenomenon. If I may, I would like to express some of the points that I think in this debate, and I do not have answers and do not have operational answers to, I think nobody has operational answers to this question, what is the role of governments in internet governance? We can have a discussion in specific organizations on specific policy areas. We can have the discussion, but having a universal answer to that is pretty difficult. But nonetheless, I would like to point out that in this debate, which I personally have been following for more than 10 years now, I think there are a couple of misunderstandings which will be helpful to clarify, or at least I will give my perspective, and that might be helpful to clarify. The first is that governments, the term government is used with different meanings across the world. Now, I understand that in certain parts of the world, when you talk about government, you're talking basically about states. But if you go, for example, in Italy, the term government has a much more specific meaning, which is the executive branch of the government, and of the state. There are other branches, the parliamentary branch, independent authorities, the judiciary branch. And I'm not saying this to complicate what is already a complicated discussion, but I do it because there is a certain tendency, in my view, to approach this discussion in a very monolithic fashion. Considering governments as if the executive branch was the full expression of what happens in any particular country, which is not the case. And secondly, because I'm not going to name names, I'm going to take the example of my colleague on the right, but there are different governments which have different priorities, which have different histories, which have different traditions. And sometimes in the debates on internet governance, it seems to me that we are always, or well, not me, but others, are always just exposing civil society, which I don't even know what it means in practice, but let's simplify, civil society against all governments. Different governments have different points of view on these issues, and we should keep them in mind when we have these debates. Just very quickly, two other points that I wanted to make. Just like the internet is not the first or the only cross-border phenomenon that we have to deal with, the question of what is the role of government on the internet is part of a broader discussion of what is the role of government in a society that is changing because of globalization, because of technological advances, not only in the telecommunication area, but also in biotechnology, agribusiness, you name it. That is not an easy debate. However, I'm also a bit perplexed by the fact that it seems to me, that is my opinion, that people sometimes seem to ignore the huge efforts that many states or governments, or whatever you want to define them, are doing to adapt themselves. I mean, states and governments are entities which are not incredibly old, but they are certainly older than the internet. They have certain traditions, they have been built in a particular way, they function in a particular way. We may discuss whether they function properly or not. But the point is that in the field of the internet, as in other fields, governments are trying very hard, certainly European governments, and I believe the US, and certainly all the governments that are sitting at this table, that's diplomatic approach, are trying very hard to reform themselves, to be more inclusive, to listen to people, to use the internet and other ICTs to involve citizens. That takes a bit of time, and from my perspective, the kind of monolithic debate that we have had until now, wall against wall debate, it doesn't help, frankly, because it just doesn't give enough reason to your average civil servant in any government to spend the time to try and push for reforms inside which are difficult to implement, if in any case on the other side you have somebody that is considering you an enemy no matter what. And that is something that, as you may understand, I personally feel very much. I think it's something that we all have to learn to listen to one another. And the very last point I would like to make, and as I think it was Sally Wentworth that mentioned the fact that we have some familiar faces, but also some new faces, which also makes me very happy, because one risk that we run, this debate can become very arcane very quickly. I mean, if you go on the street and you ask any citizen, what's your opinion on WSIS? Well, I think his eyes will just glaze over. But if you ask him, what's your opinion on the protection of geographical indications in Europe, chances are, depending on the country, that he will have an opinion, okay? Because it's something that he lives every day. If you ask him, what's your opinion on your rights as a consumer being protected? What's your opinion on your privacy being invaded or your data being used in one way or the other? He will have an opinion. And I'm not choosing these examples by chance, because these are all areas in which the European Union has repeatedly argued very strongly that there is a role for states or governments or public authorities to influence the debate. And the bottom line at the end of the day is also that we cannot, it's not that we want or we do not want, we do not have the prerogative or the right not to enforce our laws. It's our duty to do that. Now, the question on how to do that, I know perfectly well that there are very different opinions on how to do that, and I'm not saying necessarily, I'm very conscious that I'm being video recorded, but I am not saying that in each and every case, the proposals that come from Europe or that come from other parts of the world are necessarily the right ones. But when we debate those proposals, we should always forget that simply saying, okay, you know what, European consumer protection law, we don't enforce it, we don't apply it, that is not an option, full stop. Our citizens will not accept it, and certainly that is not why politicians are elected or why I do my job as a civil servant. I think I will stop here and I will leave it to my friend Veni.
Okay. Actually, I have one quick question for you. And I think it might be
I
a
hope
silly
I could skip
question.
it, but this is why I was moving very fast.
Yes, also very diplomatic. And I admit this might be a silly question, but is there anything in the operation, you participate in the European Commission, is there anything in the operation of that, how long has the European Commission been around? It's
57, we became 50 years old a few years back.
Okay, that suggests that this model, there are any lessons that can be taken from that sort of, sort of cross-border organization of governments that sort of suggests within the EU that this is a model, like a more active government participation in internet governance might be the right way to go. Does that make any sense?
I'm not sure whether the experience of the European Union or the European Commission within the European Union, as you know, the European Commission is one of the institutions within the European Union with others. I'm not so sure whether the experience of the European Commission would necessarily suggest that a stronger role of governments in internet governance is advisable or not. It depends on the policy area. What, however, is certainly my experience as European Commission official, and I guess the experience that the Commission can teach, is that it is possible to build a system. It's not easy, but it is possible to build a system in which states relinquish part of their sovereignty because it is in their interest to do so, and work together in different fashions, in a coordinated fashion. If you look at the European Union, the reality is that no matter what people who do not work closely within the European Union think, there is a lot more cooperation than enforcement, than actual enforcement. That's the reality of our job, because there is a lot of dialogue. On the other hand, and that is, and I speak personally here, my overarching question when I look at the internet governance ecosystem, I think that it's very good that we have a network of different organizations, each dealing with different aspects. I think that there should be, and this is also the position of the Commission, that there should be more cooperation and communication between different nodes of the ecosystem, some of which do not talk to one another as much as they should be. If I look at the experience of the European Union, at the end of the day, there is a backstop, which is the European Commission, which has the duty to enforce the laws, European laws that are democratically decided by the European Parliament and the Council, that is the member states. You do not have that sort of overarching enforcer in the internet ecosystem. Yeah. I'm not saying that we should have it. I'm simply saying that perhaps the parallels between the two stop here because you don't have it in the internet governance ecosystem. Maybe that's a question that should be asked, whether we need it or not.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. And thanks again. I guess, Susan, you must be feeling really like thanks after thanks after thanks. But if it wasn't for you, it feels good. I'm saying it for the people who are watching. It's really an honor to be here, and I understand that you're doing this a lot with the Internet Society of the chapter of DC, which I am happy to have been member of when I used to live in Washington. And I'm happy to see also that ISOC Sally is supporting the activities of the chapter, which is important because people need to hear stuff which usually, as you were saying, that if you go on the street and you ask them about WSIS, if you go on the street and ask them about IETF, ICANN, ISOC, they will not know what it is. But if you take their phone and say, well, let me turn off your Wi-Fi or let me turn off your data, they will say, wait, this is my right. So it's more complicated than obviously the ordinary users know how the internet works. But also it's more complicated because if we accept what you were talking about, what government is, we can argue whether it's a good, bad, but people more or less have an understanding what government is. But if you ask them what governance is, and especially internet governance, you will hear a lot of different opinions. And in this audience here, there are at least half a dozen people. Some of them are walking encyclopedias about internet governance. And I'm not going to put names because we have to be diplomatic and not expose people, but they know who they are. And they also have difference of opinions. I'm sure that people sitting on the first row and people sitting on the last row will have an argument about what internet governance is. However, if we talk about English. If you bring other languages, then it becomes even more complicated because the term governance does not exist in languages like Russian or Bulgarian. And I'm from Bulgaria, so to me, I have to explain what it actually means. But also, you have to bring the different cultures. And in many cultures, if the word starts with govern, that automatically leads to government. And that automatically leaves outside of the discussion the civil society, the private sector, the individuals, the academics, everyone else but government. And in some countries, the government is more important than the parliament. And in some other countries, like the US, the Congress is more important than the government. So it's a totally different culture, which we as people who work both in the private sector and in the government have to explain to people who take decisions. So that makes the meeting in December, of which Amr was speaking at in New York, even more important because it will be defining, it will create a new document. And as we were quoting today, the Tunis Agenda, the Geneva Declaration, we will come to a point where we will have the New York something. And I don't know what this something will be. It may be called the New York Statement or the New York... It's going to be different than agenda, I'm sure. Because this is one of the things about the UN. And now, statement. But here's another thing. And I come here with a background both in governments and in private sector. And within ICANN, there are other people who are also from governmental background, but many people are from private businesses. So we kind of combine all these two. But in Bulgaria, my native country, it's even more complicated because we're a small country. We have almost half the population of New York City. At the same time, we enjoy digital divide. And when I say enjoy, for the people in the US, you would understand what I mean, and for the people who are watching as well, the digital divide in Bulgaria is between the people who are connected at 100 megabits per second and people who are connected at 1,000 megabits per second, because they pay the same. So it's not fair. You get internet access, which is, and by the way, they pay $15 a month. So we are talking about the country, the US, that created the internet, where you have two choices. You go to the cable company or the phone company, and you think that this is the internet that you can get. And then you go to a small country like Bulgaria, and you have 2,000 internet service providers, and they're competing to get you among their customers. But I was just saying it as a point where you talk about explaining governance to a government. so that it will not interfere with the way the internet is working. And that's what we did actually in Bulgaria. In '99, we challenged the government, the Ministry of Telecommunications, which introduced licensing and registration for internet services. And we took them to the Supreme Court, we meaning the Internet Society of Bulgaria, of which I was the chair. And we were successful. We were so successful that ever since, it's been, I think, 5 or 6 parliaments now, every time they change the telecommunications law, they send me an email or give me a call and say, oh, by the way, we are not touching the articles about the domain name system and the IP address allocation. They're left to the general public. But then also, 2 more items I wanted to share. So first of all is that governments usually tend to control. I mean, we see what's happening, like if something happens bad in the society, if the internet is somehow involved, they say, oh, that means we need more control over the internet. And that immediately brings law enforcement officials, defense departments, you name it, people who usually don't know how the internet actually is running, but they just say, oh, we need some kind of control. And that brings the debate to something which, and I admit, and we have a journalist on the table, but I have read only one article a few years ago written by a Russian journalist who said, after making a review of the whole process of internet governance, explaining why in Russian there is no such term, he said that he reached to the conclusion that the question is wrong, and it shouldn't be who controls the internet, but what controls the internet. And he basically claims that whatever standards the IETF accepts, this is what makes the internet running. This is what governs the internet. He took a very practical approach. Of course, every country decides how the internet is governed within their territory, because that's the right of every country. And David and I and George Sadowski, sitting in the back, who is an ICANN board member, were part of a team for the first few, how many, maybe 5 IGFs? We did a workshop on legal framework in internet governance. So we discussed this with the Center for Democracy and Technology and other organizations. And it was fascinating to see how the good examples, and Brazil, by the way, is also a good example of governing their national segment of the internet, are actually not being followed widely. You would say, well, if you're such a successful story in Bulgaria and you have 2,000 ISPs and the internet is so cheap and so fast, why is nobody else following? Well, coming to the question about the cultural differences. When you have a culture which says everything should be centralized and governed from top to bottom. And I will finish this with a memory from the first WSIS, the first World Summit on Information Society in Geneva. This was in 2003. I was chair of the Bulgarian President's IT Advisory Committee, which I had the honor of serving for 10 years, and George was a member too, Sadowski. And we had people like Vin Cerf and Pirita Sorsa from the IMF, by the way, and other institutions. And I'm for the first time on a governmental delegation anywhere. And we go to Geneva, and there is a lady from the Foreign Ministry who took me to the room at the UN. I still remember the room. And she says, so I have other work to do. So our position here, remember this is 2003, Bulgaria was still not member of the European Union. Our position is whatever the European Union says, we follow. So don't raise your hand. Well, I listened for 10 minutes, and I realized that the diplomats there are not really technically skilled. And I'm coming from a country with technical background. I'm running an ISP, I'm chair of the Internet Society, and I started raising the flag of Bulgaria speaking. She was not there. She came 48 hours later. She comes exactly when Markus Kummer, a Swiss diplomat who was chairing this working group, is thanking me. He says, thanks to our young, well, this was, again, 12 years ago, so I was the younger person in the room, said, thanks to our young friend from Bulgaria, we achieved this progress. And she looks at me with horror in her eyes. Her eyes became, as big as the Pepsi here. And she's like, oh, you spoke. And I'm like, yeah. And as you see, there is it's good, it's not bad. But she was frightened. I mean, things have changed, obviously, in Bulgaria, for sure. But can you imagine how would somebody from a government would feel if something went wrong? If I have been on the extreme and start yelling at the people and telling them that they don't understand how the internet runs and stuff like that. So I think it's a process in which the government and the private and everybody else actually should teach each other. The civil society, the businesses have to learn a little bit about diplomatic language, and thanks, David, you just gave a great example of not naming a country when you were asked. But I think also they have to learn how the internet works, why there is not a single entity or a single person who can remove a country from the internet, for example.
Okay, excellent. I'm going to spare you a question, so we can move right to audience questions. Are folks ready to go? I was going to ask a question, but I think... Okay, excellent. We have a microphone. And if you can give your name and if there's an affiliation that's relevant, that would be great. Just.
Hi, my name is Tanel Zop. I'm from the Embassy of Estonia, or Estonia, like we sometimes say. And as Sally, you were the first one who mentioned the WSIS acronym. I guess that my question is to you. From Dubai on, there has been really kind of clash of two schools, how the internet should be governed. This multi-stakeholder model or more government focused model. Do you think that there has been some kind of change or development in thinking so that we could have more agreeable solution or solution that would be better for us who we are all thinking about the multi-stakeholder model, and especially in the context of current politics. If you take the privacy questions, or especially now the terrorism questions and the campaigns, maybe YouTube clips that really have an effect in radicalization process. Thanks.
Sure, there's a lot in that question. I think as it was noted, there was the slide, and you see the world, of course, in the WICET, which was the other acronym, the World Conference on International Telecommunications, which was raised. There was a divide in short because you have a binary choice, right? You adopt or you ascribe to the treaty or you don't in that instance. I think it's not useful to see the internet governance discussion as polarized like that, and you'd hope it wouldn't be going forward. And we need to find the solution so that it doesn't emerge that way. But as more and more countries try to grapple with these issues of, on the one hand, we want more security, right? We have certain expectations of our government on, identifying criminals and doing the things we expect them to do in law enforcement. On the other hand, we also, as citizens, want our privacy protected. We want our individual communications to be secure and to be our own and not to be surveilled or otherwise monitored. And we have these competing. This is the tussle, right? And no single piece of legislation, no treaty, or even, frankly, technical standards is going to solve that. It is an inherently complex problem. And I think as more governments try to grapple with those things, security being a great example, you're seeing people look at them in multifaceted ways. There may be a role for public policy. There's most definitely a role for technical standards. There is clearly a role for business policy and best practices. There is a role and an important voice for civil society and human rights organizations in this debate. You can't just take it to one stakeholder and say, we're going to solve it, don't you worry, and then we'll let you know how it turns out. That's not how and that to me is a really tangible example of internet governance without all the acronyms and the various organizations, but really looking at, this is a hard public policy problem. If you want to, and it's a technical problem, and it's a commercial challenge, and all these other pieces, if you want to really move things forward so we have trust, so that innovation can continue, then you're going to have to bring the parties to the table who can help address those problems. You can't, the IETF, they can do pieces, but they can't present it to the world as we've solved it any more than the U.S. Congress or an institution with the UN could do that. It has to be collective. It has to be collaborative.
Is there,
May I
yeah,
address this?
absolutely. I just want to, sorry again to hog the microphone, but one of the things that struck me is all the coverage about this topic in the United States, it tends to be very negative, right? This is
Right.
the UN seizing control of the internet. And I know that we have government representatives and also very diplomatic folks on our panel. But I was struck that it seems to be, there's a great deal of openness now towards the idea of governments playing more of a role than they have in the past. So I would just sort of like, I'd love for you to respond to his question, but just sort of like with that in mind, am I just looking at this? Yes, please.
I wanted to react, and on your point as well, on the point of our moderator, but also on the question. I think that part of the reason why we have seen between the World Conference on International Telecommunication in terms of international discussion, which was 2012, and the latest plenipotentiary meeting of the ITU, we have seen a very different tone in the discussion, is partially due to the fact that some very big players in the international scene have toned down a little bit the rhetorics which existed of the UN is taking over the internet. And back in 2012, we heard rather high-level people in rather important public and private organizations dealing with the internet referring to UN bureaucrats as dinosaurs with pea-sized brains or something like that. We had someone else say that we had to kneecap the United Nations, shoot in the knee. Now, I don't want to be too melodramatic, but I come from Italy, which was a country in the 70s, had a very big terroristic problem. And one of the preferred techniques for left and right-wing terrorists was kneecapping people. Okay, so for me, hearing somebody using that kind of metaphor is really, when I heard it the first time, I said, oh my God, what is this person saying? And being diplomatic, I will not name the person, but it's all on Google. You can all, or sorry, shouldn't have mentioned one single company. It's on any search engine you may wish to use or not use. So it's very, I think it's very good that some of the biggest players, public and private, have changed attitude, and the results are clear in the eyes of everybody. The latest debates we had are, it doesn't mean that we agree, but are a lot less contentious than they used to be. I will make another practical example just by, and it's an area in which I think there is still work to do, but it's again to give an example of how difficult is it sometimes to understand each other. Within ICANN, the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, that my colleague on the left is a vice president of, there have been for a long time a debate, and there still is a debate on the introduction of new generic top-level domains, rather than .com, .net, .org, .whatever. And I will not go into the details. There will be time. Actually, tomorrow there is State of the Net, and I guess we will have the time to go more into the details of some of these issues. There was one specific couple of generic top-level domains, .van and .wine. We, the European Union and its member states, raised an issue, which is that we wanted top-level domains referring to wines to have the same level of protection for geographical indication, which in Europe are very important, than others. Other countries disagreed, and that is perfectly fine because there are different, there are international obligations. But I had, when I was working in the Governmental Advisory Committee, I had people coming to me and telling me, literally, who cares about your stupid geographical indication? That is not a way to have a dialogue. And unfortunately, now things are changing, and it's not because I'm European. I would never go to another country or someone from another country and tell them who cares about your, take an example of something that is very important. I would not go to a US person and telling him, I don't care about your First Amendment. Whatever opinion I might have of that, because I know it's very sensitive in this country. So that is where this discussion that we're having are necessary. I think they become a bit too theoretical too quickly, to be very honest. We had to start from the basics that we are human beings. We're trying to talk to one another. And if there is no respect in that dialogue, we get nowhere.
Excellent. Amr, and then.
So, I guess the question was very useful into forcing us to think outside of dichotomies. Is it either or? Is it all or none? And WSIS, in a way, does address this, and particularly in the section on internet governance, when it every time it mentions governments and the multi-stakeholder, it says within their respective roles and responsibilities. So there is an inherent recognition that each stakeholder has a particular responsibility and a respective role to play. Let me give you an example, but something that we did not address here, but is very relevant to internet governance. There is a so-called GGE, Governmental Group of Experts, whose name is probably the longest name in the UN, and that's why you start to appreciate much more acronyms than the long names. Basically, I think the long name is Developments in International Communication Technology in the context of of international security. For a short name, that's basically cyber war, or that's actually armed conflict. The use of ICT is an armed conflict. So this is 15 experts nominated by their own governments to discuss rules of armed conflict or the use of ICT in armed conflict, or actually, as Egypt proposes, the non-use of ICT, because we are very much into proposing an exclusively peaceful cyberspace. Now, is there a possibility to discuss that topic without the participation of governments, who are the commanders of their own militaries and so on and so forth, and who are actually the signatories to international humanitarian law? So the whole issue is an aspect of respective role and responsibility, not necessarily that one stakeholder needs to monopolize the domain and exclude the others.
Just before I see that there will be a second question, but we have to be aware. I mean, I don't want it to sound as if the only ones that need to change are the governments. ICANN has changed as well. I mean, 2 years ago, we didn't have UN engagement presence in New York. Now we have. This is a clear sign that we are also engaging not only with the UN itself, but all the UN agencies, the missions to the UN. We have had already several briefings for them, and I have to tell you that it's really interesting to see how at the UN, in a room for 53 people, you have 75 and standing people to hear what this internet governance is about. So I think this is a process, that's why I said before, this is a process in which we all have to learn from each other.
Excellent. Did you have a question? I do. Okay. And I'm going, I hate to.
I'll let Milton go first if he wants to.
I don't know. And if we can ask for brevity, we have about 18 minutes left. I want to make sure we get a few questions.
My problem is that I don't think you're getting at the nub of the problem of governments and internet governance. Okay, to me, it's not about, on one side there's just one stakeholder called governments that make decisions, and on the other side there's a bunch of stakeholders, because every government has multiple stakeholders participating in their domestic processes. The real issue is governments are territorial monopolies on the use of force. Their domain, their jurisdiction is territorial. The internet is not, okay? Andreas, you said there have been cross-border technologies before, and there have been, but there has never been a globalized virtual space of the sort created by the internet protocols. The internet is not cross-border like, let's say, a radio signal. The internet is non-border. It is transnational, and the community of people who use it is transnational. So here's a good example of why, if you look at it purely as multiple stakeholders versus governments, you get into trouble. And Andrea, you gave us a perfect example, the .wine case. Okay, you got some very negative reactions from people saying, we don't care about your laws in this space, but that's precisely the problem. .wine is a global TLD. So by applying European law to that TLD, you are projecting European protections for indicators where there is no legal support for them. You are projecting them globally. It's sort of like the US saying, we're going to project our laws globally, which is just as bad. So the problem with internet governance is that it is not a territorial space, and governments are territorial. Now, one other point about that is why, and this is my question for the governmental representatives, why do you think you have to participate in internet governance as representatives of your people, rather than as representatives of your state apparatus? For example, if you were to send somebody to an IETF meeting, yeah, you have networks, you are affected by these standards. Nobody will object to you sending somebody to an IETF meeting and participating as a person in that process. The problem is you're trying to say, well, governments make public policy and the rest of you don't, or we're going to put governments over here in a room in the GAC and they're going to make policy, and the multi-stakeholder system is going to make policy over here, and then we're going to have a big fight about which one prevails. That doesn't make any sense. You have contradictory principles of governance, and that's what we have to solve.
I'm sorry, can you just identify yourself for the video record?
Okay, I'm Milton Mueller, Syracuse University.
Who wants to? Okay.
No, I will take it first because there was a reference to a statement that I made. Just to clarify on the .wine issue, I think that, just to be clear, the European Union has not asked that the rules of the EU are applied globally. First of all, we believe that there are international agreements on the protection of geographic indication. There are disagreements of that. I will not enter into that. What we ask is that there have to be means of recourse so that stakeholders and European citizens have the possibility. And by the way, let's not forget that it's also American wine organizations that are very much against the introduction of wine as is. So it's not about the extraterritorial application of EU law or US law or any other laws. It's the ability to have means of recourse, which in our view in the current system are deficient. And I will not go too much into the details. On the point of, you raised a very interesting question, Milton, if I can say Milton instead of Professor Mueller. We've been knowing each other for some time, so I would just work on a first-name basis. Why don't I participate to these meetings simply as a representative of a state apparatus? Well, the EU is not a state, but I got your point. And the reason why I don't do that is because if I do that, I have at the same time the power and perks and in certain cases even the immunity, not in the case of ICANN, but in other contexts I have, and obligations. Because if I do not represent European citizens in that particular context, I can say whatever I want, okay? And I don't think that's something that anybody should wish for, quite frankly. I participate, the fact that I represent European citizens constrains me, because it means that I cannot go beyond what is being democratically decided. And again, we can have a debate whether the democratic system in any particular political system is good, bad, could be made better, could be made worse. That's an interesting debate. But I really don't, I think that we have to think very, very careful before we let governmental representatives go around and do whatever they want without any kind of constraint. And I said that as a governmental representative.
David, did you have a?
Yeah, just very quickly, and I'm not going to attempt to address Milton's second question about what Andrea was just responding to. But on the first question about governments qua governments participating in this, in a kind of rivalrous fray with other stakeholders, I think the role of governments is multiple and complex. And while I don't disagree with you in one aspect that the internet in a way transcends boundaries and that is a difficult concept to relate to governments who defend boundaries. When it comes to the protection of rights, when it comes to like intellectual property rights or human rights, which can be affected on the internet, there is a role for governments to play in protecting the rights of their citizens and helping those citizens assert those rights in their country where they have jurisdiction for an event that might have taken place in a different country in this transcendental internet thing. So I think there's a perfectly good role there. There's a perfectly good role for policy setting to make sure that where things occur in this transcendental environment do affect those rights, that the government has acted responsibly in order to protect its interests and those of its citizens. So I'd like to deconstruct. I'm not disagreeing with the question. I just think it needs to be deconstructed a little bit more.
Excellent. Carolina, did you have anything to jump in on? You're good? Okay. And then very quick.
Yeah, I'll just be quick. I do think it raises, and your point though raises a sub-point you made of governments are not a monolithic thing. We know in the United States, the Department of Education has interests in, the internet and online education, and we know various other parts of government. And as we see in the UN system this year with the Millennium Development Goals, and you look at ICT across sectors of the economy, I think an interesting development in the internet governance discussion going forward 10 years is going to be to what extent do other parts of government come into this discussion than we've traditionally seen. So we usually see a regulator, we might usually see a Ministry of Communications, more recently the Foreign Affairs Ministries as this gets into the UN space. But what happens when the Ministry of Economy in general comes forward, or the Ministries of Education, Health, that have clear interests in online privacy or clear interests in data gathering and data distribution, when they start coming into this discussion in a clearer way, I think that's going to change the nature of the debate. It's an interesting concept, and we know there aren't necessarily monolithic, and the agencies that have to coordinate the other agencies have real challenges. So it could change the discussion.
Sir.
Thank you. My name is George Sadowski. I'm on the ICANN board, but unlike Andrea, I have the privilege of saying here that I can and I do speak for myself. Internet governance discussions like this often range from the very general statements of political philosophy and organization of government to the very specific issues of .wine. Which has a long history of legal issues and copyright issues and geographic identification policy behind it. And I think sometimes it's hard to look at a ground like this, which is littered with issues and actors and four-letter acronyms, and make some sense out of it. I think we've run out of three-letter acronyms, so we're into four with a vengeance. So I'd like to propose, and this is what I'd like the panel's comments on, an initial simplification of this complex space, and that is to look at it and say, well, look, there are two major clusters here. And although there's interaction between them, we really ought to look at them separately because they reflect different things and they ought to be dealt with in different ways. And the distinction is between the issues that are relate to governance of the internet, and I'd almost say administration of the internet because I think that's almost synonymous, not quite, and governance on the internet. Governance of the internet means keeping the thing going, the pipes, the routers, the ISPs, the telecom circuits, et cetera, et cetera. And there are a lot of technical people who do that, and there are a lot of cooperating organizations, as Sally mentioned, that are involved in that. Governance on the internet, on the other hand, refers to problems that have existed before and are taking either new shape or heightened awareness or some kind of prominence on the internet. I'll use crime as an example. Crime existed before the internet. Cybercrime exists after the internet. And I'd suggest that a litmus test of deciding where to put an issue between these two clusters is simply to ask the question, did the problem exist before the internet existed? And if it didn't, it's a governance of the internet issue. And if it did, it's a governance on the internet issue. And with respect to the governance on the internet issues, these issues have existed probably from time immemorial and are being recognized over time. There are social institutions, governmental institutions, private institutions that have been set up to deal with them outside the internet space, and therefore it's a known problem. And the kinds of skills and whatever to tackle these problems is really very different from the skill of running the internet, making sure that the packets go from here to there. Okay. There is an interface between the two. What I'm saying is somewhat simplistic also. There are not two separate and distinct clusters because clearly there is an interface. They bleed together. What Sally talked about in her very good description of the intersection of technology and policy comes in here, and if you don't understand both and how they intersect, you're likely to make mistakes. Finally, I think that the importance of the clusters is that when people talk about internet governance, if you don't differentiate, then you may think that something you're talking about applies to both or one or to the other, and you may lead you to very strange, different, unworkable, and inefficient and ineffective solutions. So what does the panel think?
Okay,
Thank you.
I would just say, as a layperson, it makes me wonder where .wine fits into that. Is it on or of?
Yeah, I think the distinction is useful for helping to simplify, as George said. I do get the sense, though, that the hardest challenges, the hardest problems come when you get the intersection, right, between the solution to a challenge and what's on the internet, I think, is driven by the governance or the solutions of the internet. So, when the technology has to be engaged to help solve these other problems like crime or whatnot, then that seems to me to be where the rub is on governance. Because who does that? Is that a technical problem or is that a policy problem? When you know clearly this is crime and you know clearly this is a router, those are easier. It's when you get to the middle and the blurring that I think is where you get unfortunately, the conflict.
I think the only place where wine shouldn't be is closed in a bottle, to stay in glasses or in yourself. I think the conceptual distinction that George Sadowski puts on the table, which is, it is a powerful conceptual distinction. I must admit, I was very much in love with it. I used it for many years in my professional life. But in those same years in my professional life, I came to realize that in practical terms, it happens more often that there are interactions between the governance of the internet and the governance on the internet than they don't happen. And therefore, the value of the distinction to me is somewhat limited. What we proposed, the European Commission proposed, and the member states of the European Union have agreed in terms of a political position, is that there should be, just like public authorities or governments or parliaments or whatever you want to call them, should listen more to the technologists around there, and I absolutely do not disagree. I've been working in government for a long time, and sometimes I am horrified by the very, very low understanding of technological realities that some of my, I would say especially older colleagues, but even the young generation from time to time is surprising from this point of view. But the technical, what is called the technical community, and in development of protocols and standards and technology does not exist in a vacuum, and technological choices have policy implications. If you design a protocol in a way rather than another, there are implications on how the communication using the protocol respects privacy or it doesn't, or protects against surveillance or it doesn't, or ensures cybersecurity or it doesn't, and so on and so forth. Our position is that there should be a more structured upstream involvement of not only governments but all stakeholders into the development of technological standards. Now the IETF, or at least the IETF persons that I spoke with about this, they will tell you, well, the IETF is open. Anybody can participate, which is true. It is absolutely true. The problem is that too much openness or complete openness does not necessarily translate into the involvement of people who might not even know what the IETF is, but yet they might have a very strong opinion and even a very strong expertise on the particular policy problem that those technological decisions might impact onto. So at the end of the day, I get back again to my point is it is all about dialogue, and dialogue does not happen by itself. It has to be designed, it has to be nurtured, it has to be strengthened, it has to be defended.
Just to make sure that the representative of the technology company plus the government, the clocks that you're looking at, they're 2 minutes ahead, so we have 2 more minutes than you were initially thinking. The second thing is that George Sadowski just made the life of interpreters more difficult, because I was trying to explain you cannot tell certain individuals from certain countries and cultures what governance is. Now you're talking about such a small difference, which is even to me, and I claim that I can speak English more or less well, even though it's not my first, not even my second or third language, but it's difficult to understand it. Now you can explain it, but it will be even more difficult to explain. Imagine you have to go and explain it to a bunch of people in Bulgaria. And actually, I will use this opportunity. George was in Bulgaria. In 2002, I believe, he was head of the Global Internet Policy Initiative, which was trying to help Bulgaria change its legislation to be more internet-friendly, which it did. However, he had a meeting with Jim Dempsey of the CDT at the Bulgarian parliament at the big, it's a hall bigger than this one, huge table, members of the parliament, the Committee on Transport, IT and Communications. People listen, there is interpretation, professionally done, everything is crystal clear, at least to me. Then the conversation, the meeting ends, the chairman of the committee came to me and says, Veni, I don't know anything, I didn't understand anything from what these guys said. But since they're here, it must be important. So, George, thank you for this.
Okay. We actually have I'm not clear at what time it actually is now. We have 2 minutes. So if you could just very briefly ask a question, we'll see if we can tackle it, but
Actually,
just very quickly.
It's actually from one of our remote participants, Peter Knight. He actually had 2 questions, but we're only going to ask one. He wanted to question to the Carolina, the person from Brazil, to wondering because of Brazil's huge support for multi-stakeholderism, he was wondering why in the Wicket they voted to support the treaty as opposed to being with the other members who were supporting that. So.
Okay, first of all, thank you for that question. And well, let me first say that, as Sally has mentioned, we shouldn't say that it's a binary choice. During the weekend, they were discussing the ITR, and which was to update the old international telecommunications regulations. It was much broader, and it was necessary to actually update it. It's not only about one issue or about, and we don't feel that it wasn't about internet freedom or anything. It was a much broader regulations and included many different areas. And Brazil feels that the ITU actually has a role in terms of internet governance, in according, with the Tunis agenda.
Excellent. Thank you. Are we all done? We're all done. Thank you all very much. Appreciate it.
I want to just ask you one other thing. I want to thank all the speakers and Nancy especially, who really went out of her way to moderate and came up with a lot of good questions. Our next event will be 324, and we're looking at the change role of governments since the Charlie Hebdo situation. They seem to have gotten more involved in surveillance, so we're going to look at surveillance and internet governance and what's happening there. So we look forward to seeing you then, and get home safely or get back to work safely. Thanks for coming. Please come the next one.
No, I know.